The story of Noah's Ark is one of the most fascinating and intriguing stories known to mankind.
In a groundbreaking development that has captivated both the scientific community and religious scholars alike, new evidence has surfaced that may shed light on one of the most ancient and enduring stories in human history, Noah's flood. Scientists are now closer than ever to uncovering the truth behind this legendary flood. The long-standing skepticism. The biblical flood narrative, detailed in the Bible book of Genesis, is widely regarded by scholars as a composite of earlier Mesopotamian flood myths, rather than an independent historical account. This perspective does not imply that all biblical claims are false, but specifically addresses the origins and nature of the flood story within the Bible. The biblical account, according to this perspective, appears to be a collection of multiple flood traditions, primarily drawn from Mesopotamian sources. The Sumerian Eridu Genesis, dating to the 17th century BCE, the Akkadian Atrahasis epic from the 18th century BCE, and the Epic of Gilgamesh, with its most complete version preserved on 12 clay tablets from the library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, all contain flood narratives that supposedly predate the biblical story. The Epic of Gilgamesh features the hero Gilgamesh, who, upon learning of the flood from the immortal flood survivor Utnapishtim, embarks on a quest for eternal life. Utnapishtim recounts how the god Ea, or Enki in Sumerian, warned him of the god's plan to annihilate humanity with a flood.
People, the flood is imminent! Board the ark!
Following divine instructions, Utnapishtim built a boat, saving his family, animals, and livestock. The flood receded, and the gods regretted their decision, granting Utnapishtim immortality. This story bears striking similarities to the biblical flood account, including themes of divine regret and the salvation of a select few. Proponents of this ideology claim that historical interactions between the Israelites and Mesopotamians, such as the Assyrian conquest of Israel in 721 BCE and the siege of Jerusalem, suggest that Mesopotamian flood stories influenced the Hebrew flood narrative. The Israelites adapted these narratives to fit their monotheistic context, integrating key elements such as the global flood, the ark, and divine remorse, while aligning them with their theological beliefs. Some argue that the flood narrative should not be interpreted literally. They argue that taking the story at face value is not only outdated, but fundamentally flawed. For instance, fundamentalists and creationists insist on a literal interpretation, believing that the ancient authors intended to convey the flood as a historical fact. However, skeptics suggest that interpreting these ancient texts literally is akin to misapplying modern standards to historical artifacts. They argue that the original purpose of such stories may have been to convey moral or cultural truths rather than historical facts. Just as cave paintings were not meant to be seen through the lens of contemporary art, ancient texts should not be expected to conform to modern definitions of historical accuracy. Interestingly, the Bible not only recounts the events of Noah's flood, but also foretells the skepticism that would surround it. In 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 5 to 6, it is written that in the last days, people would deliberately forget that by God's word, the heavens existed and the earth was formed out of water and by water. The passage goes on to say that by these waters, the world of that time was deluged and destroyed. This scripture highlights that denial and skepticism about the flood were anticipated long ago. The Bible's author understood that as time passed, the idea of a global flood would be questioned and dismissed by many. Yet, this very skepticism is part of the prophetic narrative, underscoring the enduring relevance of the biblical account. Breakthrough discovery in geology. Recent discoveries in geology have brought to light convincing evidence supporting the biblical account of Noah's flood. The fossilized rock layers that span across continents suggest that the Earth experienced a catastrophic flood, which is consistent with the description found in Genesis. These rock layers, known as megasequences, reveal a pattern of progressive inundation, providing key insights into the events that unfolded during this monumental flood. Before the flood, it is believed that the continents were configured in a Pangea-like supercontinent, This arrangement allowed for a uniform and global impact when the floodwaters began to rise. Modern geology has identified several megasequences, large stacked layers of sedimentary rock, that corroborate this theory. Each megasequence contains a distinct pattern, a foundation of coarse sandstone at the bottom, gradually transitioning to finer sediments toward the top. This sequence suggests a progressive, rather than instantaneous, flooding event, where sediments were deposited over time by advancing waters. Evolutionary geologists traditionally interpret these megasequences as the result of 6 massive flooding events occurring over millions of years. However, creation geologists propose a different interpretation, arguing that these layers were formed rapidly, within days or weeks, by a series of tsunamis during the year-long flood described in Genesis. This rapid deposition is supported by examples from recorded history, where tsunamis caused by tectonic subduction have laid down similar layered sediments in a matter of days. The global mapping of pre-flood sedimentary layers, using over 3,000 stratigraphic columns, provides further evidence of this catastrophic event. These columns show the thickness and extent of the megasequences across different continents, revealing that the highest pre-flood elevations were likely only 3,000 to 4,000 feet. The data also indicate that the shallow seas were filled in first by the earliest deposits, followed by the inundation of lowlands and uplands as the water levels continued to rise. The first 3 megasequences primarily buried shallow marine environments, which existed across several continents. The fossil record within these early flood sediments is dominated by shallow marine plants and animals, with very few trees or land animals present. This pattern is consistent with the initial 40 days of the flood, where the waters gradually engulfed the shallow seas before advancing onto the land. Notably, regions such as the central USA, referred to by some as Dinosaur Peninsula, show minimal early flood sedimentation, suggesting these areas were lowland or swampy regions that remained above water during the initial stages of the flood. The fourth megasequence, known as the Absaroka, marked a significant turning point in the flood's progression. This sequence produced waves that began to deposit sediments onto the land, burying lowlands and coastal wetland areas, such as the Karoo supergroup in southern Africa and the Coconino sandstone in the southwestern United States. This stage of the flood also laid down the first major coal deposits formed from vast forests of lycopods. The presence of land animals, marine creatures, and plants within this sequence indicates that the floodwaters were now impacting significant portions of the pre-flood land, including parts of the Dinosaur Peninsula. By the time of the 5th megasequence, the Zuni, the flood had completely overrun the lowlands and even submerged most of the highest hills. The Zuni sequence is responsible for the extinction of the dinosaurs and the complete inundation of the Dinosaur Peninsula. According to the biblical timeline, this event occurred around day 150 of the flood, by which time all land animals and humans not aboard the ark had perished. The distribution of these megasequences across the continents is particularly telling. The sedimentary layers thin out towards shield areas, exposed crystalline crusts that likely represent remnants of pre-flood uplands. The absence of thick sedimentary deposits in these regions supports the biblical account that the highest hills were only covered by about 22 feet of water, as stated in Genesis chapter 7, verse 20. The final megasequence, known as the Tejas, contains fossils of plants and animals from the upland areas of the pre-flood world. These fossils include large mammals, birds, and flowering plants, as well as any human remains. The presence of these organisms in the uppermost layers of sediment indicates that the floodwaters eventually reached the highest elevations, sweeping away any remaining life forms. The evidence from these megasequences explains not only the distribution of fossils across the globe, but also why human fossils are so rare and why dinosaurs are not found in the earliest flood rocks. The progressive nature of the flood, as recorded in these rock layers, is consistent with the biblical narrative, where marine fossils are found in the earliest layers, followed by land plants and animals, and finally, the upland species. Perhaps the most compelling aspect of this evidence is the global consistency of these geological patterns. The fact that all continents exhibit the same basic sequence of fossilized layers from marine to terrestrial organisms strongly suggests a global event.
Every color on here is a different kind of rock layer.
Fossils, compelling evidence. Fossils serve as compelling evidence of a global flood. especially when we consider where and how they are found. These fossils, particularly marine fossils found far from their natural habitats, provide a clear record of a catastrophic event that aligns with the description of a global flood in the Bible. One of the most striking pieces of evidence comes from the discovery of marine fossils in some of the world's highest locations, such as the Himalayas. Fossilized remains of ammonites, marine mollusks with coiled shells, have been discovered in limestone layers near the summit of Mount Everest. These creatures once lived in the ocean, yet their fossils are now found in the highest mountain range on Earth. This suggests that the sedimentary layers forming these mountains were originally laid down under the sea and were later uplifted through tectonic activity, consistent with the idea of a massive flood covering the continents. Similarly, the Grand Canyon in Arizona offers powerful evidence of a global flood. The Redwall limestone, which sits nearly 3,000 feet above sea level, is packed with marine fossils, including brachiopods, corals, bryozoans, crinoids, and various mollusks. These marine creatures were clearly not native to the high, dry land where their fossils are now found. The chaotic and jumbled state of these fossils, often found in disarray, indicates they were rapidly buried by sediment, which is a hallmark of a large-scale flood. The Grand Canyon also contains one of the most extensive fossil graveyards on Earth, where billions of nautiloids, marine creatures with elongated, chambered shells, are preserved. These fossils are found alongside other marine life forms, all entombed within a vast area covering thousands of square miles.
Well, Hughes, I've had this out in the Grand Canyon many times in my pack.
The sheer scale and concentration of these fossils point to a sudden, catastrophic event that buried these creatures in an instant. The flood described in the Bible is the only event of this magnitude that can account for such extensive and rapid fossilization. Around the world, similar fossil graveyards have been discovered, providing further evidence of a global flood. For example, in Mont-Saint-Lemine, France, a fossil site reveals a mix of marine organisms alongside amphibians, insects, and reptiles. This combination of species from different environments suggests that a massive, sweeping flood gathered and buried creatures from both land and sea together. Such an event is consistent with the idea of a global, catastrophic flood that overwhelmed entire ecosystems in a short period. The state of preservation of these fossils also supports the flood narrative. Many fossils show an extraordinary level of detail, indicating they were buried quickly and without time to decay. For instance, fish fossils often display fine details such as fins and eye sockets, while trilobite fossils preserve the intricate structures of their eyes. This level of preservation is only possible if the organisms were rapidly entombed in sediment, a scenario that fits the description of a sudden global flood. Even more compelling is the discovery of fossils of soft-bodied creatures, which are rarely preserved due to their delicate nature. In the South Australian outback, thousands of fossilized jellyfish have been found in a sandstone bed covering more than 400 square miles. These jellyfish fossils are impeccably preserved, even though modern jellyfish disintegrate quickly when stranded on a beach. The rapid burial necessary to preserve such fragile organisms suggests a sudden, catastrophic event, again pointing to the global flood described in ancient texts. Another remarkable fossil discovery includes squids with ink sacs still intact and an ichthyosaur, a large marine reptile, fossilized in the act of giving birth. These fossils capture moments frozen in time, providing clear evidence that these creatures were buried instantaneously by a massive catastrophic event. The scale and suddenness of this burial are consistent with the global flood as described in the Bible. Upright fossilized trees. The discovery of upright fossilized trees, known as polystrate fossils, offers strong evidence that challenges the traditional geological interpretation of slow sedimentary processes over millions of years. Polystrate fossils are tree trunks that extend through multiple layers of sediment, sometimes through what is traditionally interpreted as millions of years of geological history. If these layers were deposited slowly, as conventional geology suggests, the tops of these trees would have decayed long before being buried. However, the presence of well-preserved tree trunks cutting through these layers points to rapid sedimentation, likely occurring within a much shorter time frame. One of the most obvious examples comes from the British coal measures, where tree trunks have been found extending through several layers of coal. Derek Ager, a respected professor of geology at Swansea University, acknowledged the inconsistency between the slow, gradual processes typically taught and the existence of these polystrate fossils. He noted that if the layers were deposited at the assumed slow rate, it would have taken 100,000 years to bury a tree just 10 meters tall. This time frame is unlikely because the tree would have decayed long before being completely buried. Ager concluded that the sedimentation must have been extremely rapid at times, effectively burying the trees before they could decompose. The existence of polystrate fossils is not limited to one geographic location. They have been found in various parts of the world, including Northumberland in the UK, Tennessee in the USA, and Newcastle in Australia. In all these locations, the trees share similar characteristics. They are stripped of their roots and branches, lack surrounding soil, and often show signs of having been transported by water before being deposited in an upright position. This pattern strongly indicates that the trees were uprooted, carried by floodwaters, and then rapidly buried in their current positions. The implications of these findings are significant. The rapid burial of these trees suggests that the sediment layers they are found in were deposited in quick succession, rather than over millions of years. This observation is consistent with the idea of a large-scale flood event, which would have the power to transport and deposit such massive amounts of sediment in a relatively short time. Moreover, the global distribution of these polystrate fossils further supports the idea of a worldwide flood. The Carboniferous coal deposits, where many of these fossils are found, extend over vast areas, covering approximately 180 degrees of the Earth's surface. The uniformity of these deposits across such a wide area, with identical fossils and coal seams, suggests a singular, large-scale event rather than isolated regional floods. Critics within the evolutionary community have struggled to provide a satisfactory explanation for these polystrate fossils. Some have suggested that local rapid flooding events could account for the tree's preservation. However, this explanation falls short when considering the scale and distribution of the deposits. Local floods do not account for the widespread and consistent nature of these fossilized trees across multiple continents. Further experimental evidence supports the rapid burial hypothesis. Research has shown that when wood is submerged in water, it can become waterlogged at one end, causing it to sink vertically. This process demonstrates how trees could have been deposited in an upright position during a flood, further corroborating the observations of polystrate fossils in the field. Unfractured rock layers. One of the most persuasive geological indicators of a global flood, as described in Genesis 7 and 8, is the presence of folded rock layers that show no signs of fracturing. These formations provide strong evidence that the sedimentary layers were laid down rapidly and folded while still soft and pliable, aligning with the narrative of a catastrophic flood that reshaped the Earth's surface within a short period. In the realm of geology, when solid rock is bent or folded, it typically fractures and breaks because it is brittle. The phenomenon of rock folding without fracturing poses a significant challenge to the conventional geological model, which posits that sedimentary layers were deposited over millions of years. For these layers to fold without breaking, they must have remained soft and pliable at the time of folding, a scenario that is difficult to reconcile with the idea of gradual deposition over vast geological timescales. The Grand Canyon provides a striking example of folded rock layers without fracturing, particularly in the 4,500-foot sequence of sedimentary layers that make up its walls. These layers, which include formations such as the Tapeats sandstone, Muav limestone, and Redwall limestone, have been bent at angles up to 90 degrees in some areas, yet they show no signs of the fracturing that would be expected if they were hard, brittle rock at the time of folding. For instance, the East Kaibab monocline, a large step-like fold marking the boundary between the Kaibab Plateau and the less uplifted eastern Grand Canyon, displays sandstone layers bent sharply without any visible fractures. Similarly, in Carbon Canyon and along Quagan Creek, the Tapeats sandstone and Muav limestone layers are folded without breaking, indicating that these sediments were still soft and flexible when they were deformed. Uniformitarian geologists, who believe in a slow and gradual process of sediment deposition over millions of years, are faced with a significant dilemma when confronted with these folded layers. According to their timeline, the Tapeats sandstone and Muav limestone were deposited 500 to 520 million years ago, the Redwall limestone 330 to 340 million years ago, and the Kaibab limestone 260 million years ago. The folding event that uplifted the Kaibab Plateau is believed to have occurred about 60 million years ago, which implies a period of around 440 million years between the initial deposition and the subsequent folding. If this timeline were accurate, the sedimentary layers should have hardened into solid rock long before the folding occurred. As hard, brittle rock, they would have fractured and shattered under the stress of folding. But this is not what we observe. Instead, the layers appear to have been folded while still soft and pliable, suggesting that the time between their deposition and folding was much shorter than the conventional timeline suggests. The evidence of folded rock layers without fracturing aligns well with the model of a global flood, as described in the Bible. According to this model, the sedimentary layers were deposited rapidly, one on top of the other, during the year-long flood. As the floodwaters receded and the Earth's crust experienced massive tectonic upheavals, these layers were folded while still soft, preventing them from fracturing. This rapid deposition and folding scenario also accounts for the lack of metamorphic changes in the minerals of these rock layers. If the layers had been subjected to millions of years of heat and pressure, as required by the conventional model, we would expect to see signs of metamorphism, such as the formation of new minerals or the recrystallization of existing ones. However, such changes are not observed in these rocks, further supporting the idea that they were deposited and folded in a much shorter time frame. The presence of folded rock layers without fracturing is a powerful geological indicator of a global flood. The evidence from formations like those in the Grand Canyon challenges the conventional geological timeline and supports the idea that these layers were deposited rapidly and folded while still soft. This aligns with the account of a cataclysmic flood that occurred over a short period, radically altering the Earth's surface. The geological record, when examined in this light, provides compelling evidence that such a flood did indeed take place, leaving behind folded rock layers that bear witness to this world-changing event. Striking geological features. If a global flood inundated the Earth for over 6 months, the evidence of such a colossal event would be striking and widespread. One would expect to find clear signs of intense, pervasive erosion and sediment transport, shaped by the immense forces of moving water. Consider Wallamambi Falls near Armidale, New South Wales, Australia. Here, sediment layers are tilted almost 90 degrees. This vertical orientation indicates that these layers were subjected to powerful forces before the floodwaters receded and carved the flat plateau. If these layers had been eroded over millions of years, one would expect differential weathering, where softer layers erode more quickly than harder ones. Instead, the even cutting through both hard and soft layers suggests a uniform force, indicative of the raging floodwaters. Large boulders, such as those found in Coober Pedy, South Australia, and Katachuta in the Northern Territory, further support this view. The rounding and transportation of these massive rocks require enormous volumes of water capable of moving and reshaping them. The presence of such rounded boulders indicates that substantial floodwaters were involved in their displacement and erosion. The Grand Canyon offers another significant piece of evidence. Surrounded by a flat, erosional plateau, the Grand Canyon features wide valleys carved by massive water flows, much larger than the current river that flows through it. This phenomenon, known as an underfit river, suggests that the canyon was shaped by far more water than what is present today. The extensive erosion observed here aligns with the idea of a global flood carving out these monumental features. In Monument Valley, located within the Colorado Plateau, the landscape is characterized by towering sandstone buttes. These buttes are remnants of once extensive sedimentary layers that have been largely eroded away. The flat tops of these buttes show that water once flowed uniformly across them, removing sediment layers between the buttes as floodwaters receded. This evidence of broad, even erosion supports the notion of a substantial flood. The Blue Mountains in Australia provide additional confirmation. This region features a flat erosional plateau, with valleys much wider than the streams currently flowing through them. Such features suggest that large-scale water flows previously shaped these valleys, consistent with the concept of an underfit river or overfit valley. The evidence points to extensive erosion caused by a global-scale flood. As the floodwaters from Noah's flood receded, they would have continued to erode cliffs and valleys, further shaping the landscape. The extensive and uniform erosion observed in these features indicates that the Earth's surface was dramatically altered by the receding floodwaters. The even erosion of sediment layers and the formation of broad valleys reflect the powerful impact of a global flood. These geological features, from the tilted sediment layers at Wallamambi Falls to the rounded boulders in Australia, and the massive erosion seen in the Grand Canyon and Monument Valley, all point to the occurrence of a global flood. The evidence suggests that such a flood significantly reshaped the Earth's surface, creating the landscapes we see today. While mainstream geology may offer alternative explanations, the signs of a colossal flood are compelling and consistent with the idea of a worldwide deluge. Additionally, evidence for Noah's flood can be observed in the relatively youthful appearance of geological formations around the world. At Monument Valley in the USA, the impressive buttes stand with minimal erosion and little debris at their bases. This suggests that a massive, rapid event, rather than prolonged erosion over millions of years, shaped these formations. The lack of significant erosional debris indicates that the floodwaters, rather than ongoing erosion, were responsible for much of the landscape's current appearance. Similarly, Kata Juda in Australia displays minimal erosion at the base of its rock formations. The limited rock debris in the area supports the idea that floodwaters carried away much of the eroded material rather than gradual erosion over millions of years. In the Grand Canyon, the interface between the Coconino Sandstone and the Hermit Shale shows a remarkably clean contact with no evidence of erosion that mainstream geologists claim should span 6 million years. Furthermore, flat erosion surfaces in the canyon that supposedly represent 14 million and 100 million years also lack any visible signs of erosion. This absence of expected erosion challenges the conventional timeline and suggests that the geological features might have been shaped by more recent, rapid events like Noah's flood. Bridging theology and science. The discovery of fossil evidence that supports the belief in a global flood brings both intriguing theological and scientific implications. Marine fossils discovered on mountain peaks like Mount Everest and in sedimentary layers throughout the Grand Canyon suggest that these areas were once submerged under ocean waters. Such findings align closely with the biblical narrative in Genesis, which describes a worldwide flood that covered the earth. The presence of sea creatures, including ammonites and various marine invertebrates, high above sea level, indicates that these fossils were deposited rapidly and extensively, likely due to a global deluge. For many theologians, this fossil evidence can be seen as reinforcing the historical accuracy of the biblical account. The alignment of physical evidence with the description of a great flood in the Bible lends credibility to the narrative, confirming that the flood was not just a myth but a significant historical event. This goes a long way to strengthen the belief that the biblical texts are grounded in historical reality and divine truth. The implications of these findings extend beyond theological validation and into the realm of scientific research. The evidence has the potential to influence future studies in several key ways. Scientists might be prompted to revisit their understanding of Earth's geological history and the processes that could have led to such widespread fossil deposits. This could include exploring the mechanisms of sedimentary deposition, fossilization, and how a global flood might have impacted the Earth's surface. The intersection of scientific evidence with biblical narratives may also encourage interdisciplinary research. Collaboration between geologists, paleontologists, and biblical scholars could lead to a more comprehensive exploration of ancient events. Such studies might integrate geological data with historical texts, offering new insights into how ancient peoples understood and recorded cataclysmic events. Public perception of the Bible and its historical accounts could also be affected by these findings. As scientific evidence appears to support the biblical flood narrative, it may influence how people view the connection between faith and science. This shift in perception might lead to broader discussions about the nature of truth and the role of religious texts in interpreting historical events. Given these findings, could the evidence pointing to a sudden and massive flood reshape our understanding of ancient history and the biblical narrative? Or is further research needed to confirm these groundbreaking discoveries?